Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Confluence Center Show and Tell. We're delighted to have you here this afternoon, and we have a wonderful lineup of colleagues who will speak about their experiences as women journalists covering the U.S. Mexico border. And this is going to be a great conversation, and we're really looking forward to the conversation, and also we encourage you to post questions and make sure that your input is part of this conversation. I'd like to make a couple of announcements. First, we're really excited next week to host a webinar with Dr. Rosana Reguillo from ITESO in Guadalajara, in Mexico. And she will be speaking about her new book, Necromáquina, Cuando Morir No Es Suficiente, which is a very acute analysis of how Mexico has transitioned from a narco violence to a necromáquina. And that's going to be a very interesting conversation. We encourage you to register, and there's going to be details in the chat about how to do that. And then on April 18, we're really proud and honored to host Marino Hosa, a Latina leader in the media who is going to be on campus speaking about different issues, and also holding a book signing. So there's going to be more information, but we're really excited to host these two wonderful talks as part of our Fronterizas lecture series. And right now, what I want to do is also take a moment to thank the Confluence Center team, which is what makes these events possible. My deepest thanks to Angela Martinez, Jasmine Vasquez, Christian Rubalcaba, our student workers, Valeria Tapia and Drew, and also to our project manager, Yadira Caballero, who is going to give the land acknowledgement today. Yadira.
Sorry. All right. So, yeah, it's Anatol, and hello and good evening. Sheya, Yadira Caballero Yanishye, look at the national Nakai Bashichin, Nasht Ejetopa A Dashache, Ado Nakai A Dashanele, Ado Diet out the Nestan initially, Ado Bidasti, Yasinasha, Ado Que A Tucson de cashed in. So, my name is Yadira Caballero, and I have introduced myself in my Dene language by telling you my clans, which establishes the connection to the land and where my family comes from. So I come from the Reed People clan and my maternal side, and I'm born for the Mexican. My maternal grandfather comes from the Zuni Edgewater, and my maternal side is Mexican. So I am honored to be here. Like many of us here, we are visitors of these lands. As we live in a current moment of transition, we have to continue to understand and listen of the longstanding history and stories that has brought you to reside on the land. The land is part of who we are. It is part of our past, our current, and our future. We should try to carry these respectfulness of the people who have been here thousands of generations and will continue for generations to come. If we could take the moment to acknowledge the University of Arizona and the city of Tucson are located on the native homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the lands of the Pasquayaqui tribe. They are the ones whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. It is a place in relation to the original people of the land and who continue to carry their traditions and cultures. Everything around us is alive. It has a purpose. It is a special place where we are surrounded by the mountains, the plants, the animals, and nearby waters, which all have meaning to the original people. We give thanks to Mother Earth and honor our life to the Creator. we look after the life on the land that is given to us. So is it imperative that we continue to carry these reflections where you currently reside and places that you go? We will continue to build our mindfulness of our present participation and listen to the stories shared by Indigenous peoples, especially the elders. So now I will pass it back to Javier, who will then speak and introduce our event for this evening. Ahihad.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Yadira, for the land acknowledgement. What I would like to do now is to take and do a moment of silence. We've been informed that we have reached a terrible milestone in terms of the pandemic. And in the state of Arizona, we have surpassed 29,000 deaths. I'd like to take 15 seconds to reflect and recognize and think in memory of those people who have left us due to the pandemic. Thank you. And now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our moderator for today's conversation, Liliana Soto. She's an assistant professor of practice at the University of Arizona School of Journalism, an assistant director for the school's bilingual journalism program, a freelance bilingual multimedia journalist, and an award-winning journalist with 10 years of experience in broadcast news in English and Spanish, with a specialization in bilingual investigative journalism, immigration, the U.S. Mexico border, Latino studies, marginalized communities, and Mexican-centric Latin culture. Liliana was one of the founders of the Central Texas chapter for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. She graduated with a bachelor's degree from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at ASU. Prior to joining academia, Liliana was an investigative enterprise news reporter and a news leader for ABC 15 Arizona in Phoenix. She was the station's expert on immigration and their first multimedia journalist to report in both English and Spanish, en inglés y en español. Her unceasing advocacy for the Spanish speakers includes creating a Spanish language section or ABC 15's website with most of her English stories translated into Spanish. Prior to joining ABC 15, Liliana was a multimedia journalist and a weekend news anchor for Univision in Phoenix, Arizona, and Austin, Texas. As a reporter for Univision, Liliana was also assigned to news correspondent for the Texas regional newscast Primera Edición and Conexión Texas, based in Houston. Her journalistic experience also includes working as a communication specialist for Mayo Clinic, a recognized world leader in patient care, education, and research, and as a freelance journalist for NBC Universal Telemundo Network. Liliana is a proud mother and strives to motivate young mothers to pursue a higher education. And tenemos mucho gusto que estés aquí. Bienvenida. Thank you, Liliana, for joining us, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Javier. Just needed to add my credit score, I think, to that to make it more extensive. But no, honestly, it's an honor to be here with all of you today. You know, a lot of the women here, the journalists here, are women that I've known, you know, for a long time, that I admire. So it's really an honor to be with you here today, especially because we're talking about a really important topic, you know, reporting on the border, and especially with all the news coming up today. I don't know if you guys have seen it on Twitter. I know my Twitter feed has been full of everything that's related to Title 42 that I hope we get to touch later, and as we know, with asylum seekers. And so I would like by introducing the outstanding panel que tenemos today, that we have today, of women journalists who have extensive experience covering immigration and the U.S. Mexico border. And so we'll start by introducing our amazing panel. And the first one will be Kendall Bliss. So Kendall is an Arizona native, currently reporting from KJCC's bureau in Hermosillo, Sonora. She covers business and economic relationships between Arizona and northern Mexico. But prior to joining KJCC, Kendall worked at Nogales International, reporting on border and immigration issues, local government, education, and business, while working on her master's degree at the University of Arizona School of Journalism, the one you guys see here in the background. Go Wildcats. She interned with the Arizona Daily Star and the Tico Times in Costa Rica and completed a thesis project about women art activists in the Arizona-Sonora borderlands. But previous to journalism and another life, she was also a teacher, helping Spanish high school students to learn English, and then heading to Tucson to teach fourth grade. So thank you, Kendall, for being here with us today. I know you are on vacation in DC, so we really appreciate you making time for us today. And our next guest is Angela Gervasi. I love your name, Angela. So Angela Gervasi is a writer, audio producer, and photographer, currently working as a reporter for the Nogales International. Great work for the Nogales International. I really, really love what they do there. She is covering the vibrant border communities of ambos Nogales and Santa Cruz County. Her reporting experience spans from Kentucky, where she covered gun safety laws, to Philadelphia, where she explored housing and justice, to Cuba, where she reported on dissident artists and censorship. Her work has been featured in outlets as NPR, Vox Media, which is VOX. Let's clarify that, not the one with the F, not that one. We'll get to that one later. And so previously to that, she also worked in Flagstaff, where she hosted NPR's Morning Edition. She is interested in stories that foster empathy, allowing audiences to meet new people, places, and cultures. Welcome, Angela. And so last but not least, we have Maritza Felix, born in Magdalena, Sonora, who is today in New York. So she's an award-winning freelance journalist, producer, writer, and founder of Conecta Arizona, Spanish language news service that connects people in Arizona and Sonora, primarily through WhatsApp and social media. She's also the co-producer and co-host of the podcast Comadres al Aire. She's also a JSK Community Impact Fellow at Stanford, IWMF Adelante, Fit Into Worlds, EWA and Listening Post Collective Fellow, and one of the Take the Lead's 50 Women Who Can Change the World of Journalism 2020 cohort. She is currently a media leader of the executive program in News Innovation and Leadership in Journalism at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, among many other accomplishments. So welcome, Maritza, who's here from New York. And so with that, I would like to move forward to our panel discussion. I know we have until 7:30 and we can be talking about this all night long, right? And so I also want to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session with questions from our audience. So stay tuned for that. And before we head out to our first question, I would like to highlight that when we talk about the border, we're talking about communities, right? We're talking about families, we're talking about culture, we're talking about environmental issues, we're talking about sports, social injustice, healthcare, policing, economy, and yes, immigration is part of it. Reporting on the border goes beyond the border wall or migrant encounters, right? Because we get those numbers every fiscal year. And it's also important to highlight that words matter when we're reporting on the border, right? And so I think my first question will be for each of you. Prior to being a border reporter, what was your first perception of the borderlands? And Kendall, I will start with you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for those wonderful introductions. It's really great to be here with all of you tonight. You know, I'm from Tucson. I was born and raised in Tucson, and you would think that would have given me a fairly decent idea of the borderlands and the border. But you know, the truth for me is that I really only had a vague sense of the borderlands growing up in Tucson. I spent some time in Ambos Nogales, but you know, it wasn't something that I thought about really frequently in my personal life. And it wasn't until I moved back to Tucson after having left that I got more interested in that and wanted to focus more on the borderlands when I went back to get my master's degree in journalism. And so for me, reporting on the borderlands has really opened my perspective up and really broadened it. And I appreciate the way that you've spoken about it already tonight, Leanna, because we do sometimes have a really limited view of what the borderlands mean. And yeah, I think now with almost 6 years as a reporter in this region, it's, you know, impossible for me not to see all of the connections between Arizona and Sonora and the United States and Mexico. And so, yeah, being a reporter has really expanded my perception.
Yeah, and I think, you know, for all of us, even for me, you know, I grew up in Sonora. And so I remember growing up in Sonora, I always thought the US was nothing but white and blue eyes, right? And then I moved to the US as an immigrant, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's not how I imagined the US. So I think we learn. And I think also another thing is just like, you know, even though we can have, you know, a year, 2, 3, 20 years of experience working on the border, I think every time you go to the border, that's like a thing. We know we can go for one story and we can end up, you know, living with 2 or 3 or a total different story than what we originally thought. Like, we are learning constantly, right? And so I think the same question will go to you, Angela. I know you have recently started in Nogales International. So tell us a little bit about what, you know, you've been doing there, and you know, if it changed your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Liliana. So I grew up in Philadelphia, and as Kendall said, like, I didn't have a perception of the border. I knew there was a fence, and that was really about it. But I will say that growing up in Philly, I was really fortunate. I came from, you know, a family with its own immigration story from Italy, and Philadelphia has so many different cultures. And I remember when I realized I wanted to report on the border, I met this incredible journalist, Ryan Christopher Jones, who himself, his family comes from Mexico. And I remember he told me that the border is everywhere, which sounds kind of like, you know, short and sweet. But looking back on growing up in Philadelphia in the 1990s and the 2000s, there started to be a lot more migration from Puebla, from Mexico. And so personally, even though I didn't have a perception of the border, I was seeing my own neighborhood become revitalized when more Mexican immigrants started to move in and create these incredible businesses. And, you know, when I go back to Philly, I still think about the border because I really do think it's everywhere. And over the years, I've learned that, even though I'm living right here on the border, and I can see the wall right out my window, it exists everywhere.
And the same question to you, Maritza.
Bueno, primero que nada, buenas tardes, bienvenidos, welcome, willkommen. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing that right. I want to say thank you to my familia from Connect Arizona that is joining right now this panel. So I'm really, really grateful for your support. And from my cohort from CUNY that are actually here participating and learning a little bit more about the border as we speak. So I am a border child. I was born and raised in Mexico, in Magdalena de Quino, Sonora. It is just an hour drive from Nogales. And border has been part of my family since the beginning. I think as soon as you are born in Mexico, you get the passport, then you get your visa, and you start crossing the border if you have that privilege to do so. So I used to celebrate my birthdays in McDonald's and then have a piñata with tacos in Mexico. That's how close we were all the time. So I always say that I'm a Latina, I'm an immigrant, I'm a Mexican, I'm a journalist. The border has been my office, my source of inspiration, my home, my playground, everything since I can remember. And I think after the pandemic, I realized that I really wanted to invest in my community. And I have always wanted to change narratives about the border and about how we perceive it. And the border, especially between Arizona and Sonora, that is not the typical border that you see on TV when you're talking about this immigrant phenomenon that we have been seeing and living forever. So that's what I'm doing right now, trying to reshape the narrative of the border and make you and take your hand and bring it to the border and show you what we as journalists, immigrant journalists working in the border, are seeing every single day.
Thank you. And sorry if I take my video, suddenly my dog is here. So he's like, he wants to be also in the Zoom call. But when you mentioned about your birthday, you know, it reminded me of growing up. That was like the place, you know, Nogales, to go shopping for us. And I remember going to Nogales, it was just like, oh my gosh, like we thought we were going to like this big city and like, you know, the big stores. So it was pretty common for us to travel all the way from Caborca, which is like a 3-hour drive to Nogales. So thank you everyone for sharing all those amazing experiences. And so from all the work that you've been doing, what are some of the most valuable experiences that you think you have learned from reporting on the border? And I'll go in the same order. I'll start with you, Kendall.
Yeah, I think one of the most valuable lessons for me, and it maybe it sounds weird, but is just that the borderlands are an incredibly important place, not just for border communities, but for our states and for both countries. You know, the borderlands are fascinating culturally, and but they're also critical. They have an incredible role in the economies of both countries, in trade and commerce, of course, immigration. And because of all of that, they're also just they're important sites politically, and sites that are also used politically in various ways. You know, a lot of politicians come to the borderlands, sometimes just to hold press conferences with the border wall. And I think the border region has become a symbol in a lot of ways. I'm sorry, I hope you can't hear, there's a siren going by, but I think because it has been used as a symbol, and because it's a place that has a lot of political significance, the border is used in some ways as a stand-in for things that go well beyond what it really means to stand in for things that have, you know, a lot of political or emotional significance. But at the same way, it's really flattened. And so I think, you know, one of the things that I've really learned is that this is an incredibly important site. It is something that people throughout the United States should care about, but that it's so much more than what most people usually hear about. And I think, you know, the lesson is that we need to broaden that lens and to be able to look at it from different angles, and all of those things that you mentioned at the beginning: environmental, cultural, arts, you know, social justice. Those are all parts of it that sometimes get left out of the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I have one of my students today. My advanced reporting students, she was looking for a story about soccer, and she wanted to do something in the university. I'm trying my best to get him out of campus, you know, go somewhere else in the community. And so she wanted to do something with soccer, and I found this amazing story. I love the Nogales International. I think you guys, you know, most of the best reporters that I know from the border came from Nogales International. They do amazing work. And so I read a story about a coach in Rio Rico, and then she's a graduate from the university. I don't know if it was you who wrote it, and was it you who wrote it? But it was a really good story. And so I sent it to her. I was like, hey, you know, take a look at this story. And she told me today, she's like, hey, professor, I won't be in class Friday because I'm going to Rio. She's like, Rio something. I was like, Rio Rico? And she's like, yes, I'm going there. And so it's her first time that she's living in Tucson. She's going to Rio Rico. So I think it's important, you know, to also expose those stories, you know, that talk about the community. I mean, border communities are one of the safest communities in our country, right? And that's, and usually you hear drugs, immigration, you know, and you don't talk about those stories. So I think we also have a responsibility as journalists to not only look for those stories that are going to give you that click, you know, quick, but also to stories that where you're doing a service to the community, because, you know, families live there, and those are people's, you know, a lot of friends that live there, and friends. And so the same question will be for you, Angela. What is maybe some of the most valuable experience that you have learned from reporting on the border?
That's a great question. And I think Honestly, hearing people from different generations down here talk about what it was like to grow up here is like, it's such a treat for me. And I think for a lot of people, because as everyone was saying in mainstream media, like this is not portrayed as a place that has history and like memories, and it's not portrayed. I mean, there's so many like families in Nogales. Just one of my first assignments for the Nogales International was just covering the Christmas parade. And it was like the Super Bowl came through. Like there were so many people out in the streets, so many families, so many kids. Everyone was so excited. And it was like the biggest event I'd ever seen here. And I think I've had the privilege of talking to people who are like 85 and people who are 25. And just hearing them talk about both the good and the bad. I mean, you know, people talking about when they saw the fence getting progressively higher, and something a lot of residents here are not happy about, and things like that. But they're also telling you about crossing to Mexico and going to a bar at 16 and listening to like Fleetwood Mac in the 70s. It's some of the stuff is really relatable, and some of it is like, wow, I can't imagine that. And getting that mix and realizing how similar everybody's lives can be sometimes, it's really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have friends that are Mexican American, and one of my friends from Laredo, he was telling me his family has been here like from like, I don't know how many generations. So his family is probably here first before anybody else, you know. And sometimes when you hear that, go back to Mexico, his family's like, wait, well, we were here before you guys even got here. So yeah, definitely a lot of different generations. I think for me, you know, reporting on the border, I mean, every time I go there, I learn something. But one of the things that I have learned from my experience working there, like how vulnerable are some of the, you know, the communities there, especially migrants, asylum seeking migrants, you know, in the words, you know, how we describe people, that they are human beings, you know. And I think we are seeing that in different outlets like Fox, when they're constantly, you know, use the words like illegal and things like that, that dehumanize people, you know, flood, search. So I definitely have, I think one of the most valuable experiences for me have been to speak out and to hold people accountable, and also news managers accountable, even though I might be seen as the troublemaker, the problematic, the one that never shuts up, because I'm always, you know, raising my hand when something is wrong in the way that we report. So I think that has helped me to, you know, from reporting on the border, has given me that courage to be able to speak out when it comes to those issues. And so for you, Maritza, I know you're also very passionate about reporting on the border. So what are some of the most valuable experiences that you have learned?
I take notes, so be careful. I did as you were speaking, just of things that came to my mind. Well, I love the border, and it's so complicated, and it's just like a love-hate relationship that we have, and we need to learn that. Something that I really took on was the pandemic, and how seeing the border close, well, relatively close, for more than a year, it was something really powerful. Silence can be really powerful. Awkward silence are even more powerful. And that's something that we notice. And as soon as you cross to Mexico, you can hear the noise, you can hear the vibes, you can hear the people living the life. So Mexico didn't pause during the pandemic, what we did. And that's something that can teach you so much. We always think about the border just as an immigration issue. And it's a very important part of the story when we're telling something about the border, but it's not the only one. But when we do cover immigration stories, we have to remember the people are sharing with us as journalists their most vulnerable moments. And sharing that takes a lot of courage. We wouldn't do it. So that's something that I have learned through the years, is how to create that safe space for them to share those stories with me. Another thing that I think is really important, and I take that not in consideration all the time, but I should, is what happens the next day. When people crosses the border, because like they're looking for asylum, because they cross the border through the desert, because they cross the border legally on a work visa or with a tourist visa. So what happened with them the day after, 3 months after, 6 months, 3 years? And I do keep on top of them. So I keep calling them, I keep asking them how you're doing. I keep telling the same story all over and over and over, because I don't want to forget. And I don't want to forget either that we build so many human bridges across the border when somebody else, when politicians, when candidates, because we always have a candidate, are trying to build a bigger wall. We are creating these human bridges. And as you were saying, Liliana, it is really important who tells the story, who tells our story, because we are part of this community that we're living in as well. It's not us versus them, it is us. So I think it is really important to give the mic, to give the pen, to give the tools to those reporters that are leaving the border, so they can show what we're living, what we're seeing, as I was telling you. And always remember that that local journalism that we take for granted for so much is actually what it matters. And remember, with all these fancy, like traditional legacy media comes and cover whatever is happening in the border. No, your accents, your stories, your experience living and breathing in the border can be more powerful even than those 2, 3, 4 minutes that they have on air.
Yeah, I remember going to a press conference in Douglas, and as you guys know, I'm very outspoken. And so there was a press conference, which was obviously a photo op with the governor and different representatives. And there was a representative from Florida. And I remember telling him in the press conference, do you think, how many hours, I asked him, how many hours did you spend here at the border in Douglas? And he said, well, I got here last night. I was here like in the morning, briefed by whoever, whatever. And I was like, well, do you think that was enough for you to learn about the issues that border communities are facing, right? And the press conference was a photo op, and no one really talked about the issues, economic issues that this region, they were facing, right? We have, growing up at the border, we understand that coming and going, across the border, shopping, and it's important for the stores there. And we saw the devastation that caused in places like Nogales, San Luis, Calexico, all over, because they were losing through the pandemic. They weren't coming anymore to cross because they couldn't, if you had a visa. And so no one really talked about that. And I remember in my report, I mentioned that because that's important. And that's something that is important for the communities that live there. Yet no one is really acknowledging that. Another thing that for me too, I learned, and you're always going to see me on Twitter. If you follow me, I'm always retweeting American smuggler whenever there is a tweet from Border Patrol when it comes to drugs, drug seizures, because most of the, the smugglers for drugs, hard drugs, are actually Americans. And we rarely see those reports either. So, I think, like you said, Maritza, it's important that, to have those voices reporting on those stories, because we're the ones that know, and we know because we live there and we have family there and we have friends there and we care deeply about the communities. It's not only, we don't only come here to the border to do a story just for an assignment. We actually live here, and I think our voices deserve to be the ones be telling those stories. And so with that, I'll go to the next question. So if you guys can speak about on the community of the border, how do they differ, if they do differ, and if there's anything that those communities have in common when we're talking about, let's say, ambos Nogales, right? We have Nogales, Arizona, Nogales, Sonora, San Luis, Arizona, San Luis, Sonora, Douglas, Agua Prieta. So how do they differ, and what do they have in common? I'll start with you, Kendall.
Sure. Yeah, I think every border community has its own dynamic. And, it's based on a lot of things, like where is it located? Is it an urban area or a rural area? How big is the community in the U.S. versus the community in Mexico, and on both sides? And what kind of industries are on both sides of the border? Why are people crossing? So, I mean, I think there are very important differences, and I think those are important when we're reporting, because I think sometimes we, especially people maybe outside of the border area, or maybe outside of areas that are close to the border, like Arizona and Sonora, there's sort of this perception that it must all be kind of the same. And I mean, it's geographically very diverse, and there's just there are a lot of unique elements. But I also think there are important common threads. And, I loved hearing Maritza's story about crossing for her birthday. And I think one of the most important ones is, these family ties and community ties. There's such a strong connection in so many border communities, at least the ones that I know. And I don't know all of them by a long shot. There are a lot of communities, but the communities that have been able to get to know a bit, the ties between them are so strong. Family ties, economic ties. People move across the border for all kinds of reasons, from school to work, or just for recreation. And I really appreciated the land acknowledgement at the beginning of this, because these borders have not been here for very long. The vast history of this region, this borderline was not there. And so many of these communities, like you mentioned as well, these communities existed on both sides. And this wall and this line and this border has intersected communities that already existed. So I do think that border culture and that border connection is, different everywhere, but that there is something that kind of binds it through, just history and culture and connection.
Yeah, and we have family that they are U.S. citizens or residents, and they go to Nogales, Arizona to work, but they live in Nogales, Sonora, right? Because it's cheaper to live there. And we have business owners in the family that own a business in Nogales, Sonora, but then they live in Nogales, Arizona, or cousins that, they live in Nogales, Sonora, but they go to Nogales, Arizona for school. And that's how they know English and Spanish, right? Because they went to school across the border, but then they had to walk back to go home to Mexico. So yeah, a lot of, they share a lot of those family ties. And so the same question goes out to you, Angela. If you can speak on how those communities differ, or if there's anything that they have in common.
Yeah. So really the main border community I've spent time in is Ambos Nogales, but definitely, as Kendall touched on, there are, differences to every border community. I remember going to Douglas and Agua Prieta, and, even things like the landscape are very different, and that affects everything. I mean, when you look across the border fence to Nogales, Sonora, there's hills everywhere, and like houses seem to just be popping up. The growth here is huge. And then when you're in Douglas and Agua Prieta, everything's a little flatter, a little more, it's not as bustling on the Agua Prieta side as it is here in Nogales, Sonora. But yeah, those familial ties, I think, definitely run everywhere. And I think just a few weeks ago, I was talking to people who lived in Sonora, but they had bank accounts on this side of the border at Wells Fargo. And, a few months ago, Wells Fargo started to tell people living in Mexico, hey, we're closing down your bank account because you don't have a U.S. address. And that affects people. And I actually connected with a woman living in Agua Prieta. And I said, why do you want to have a bank account on this side? And, she said, it's convenient. I cross to see family. And, those connections are just common everywhere. And it makes sense. Why wouldn't you want to have a bank account if you're crossing regularly to visit your grandparents, your kids? It's, that flow of cross-border traffic is so, it's so everyday, and you don't really see it until you come here and witness it, or unless you grew up here.
Yeah. My sister, she lives in Mexico, and the kids are U.S. citizens, my nephews, And throughout the pandemic, and I know Maritza, you have reported a lot about the issues in with the pandemic, because the kids are U.S. citizens, they have the right to get their the shot here. But my sister wasn't allowed to come, even though, it was for, health purposes. So there are so many issues, we can go on and on how they, differ and what things they have in common. So what are some of the things that you have noticed, Maritza?
Well, take my hand, close your eyes, and imagine. If you are in Nogales, Arizona, you will see probably silence, a little bit of traffic, and then nobody's honking in your car. It's like you can listen to a little bit of conversation here and there, in Spanish mostly. But if you take my hand and we cross the border and we go to Mexico, and you close your eyes, you start listening to dogs barking, the buses, the bumpy streets, people selling something on the street. Nogales, Sonora is crowded, is lousy, it has a completely different vibe. And one side, we hear the silence, and the other one, we hear this, like everything that is sometimes overwhelming for us. But then if you pay real attention and you keep your eyes closed, you will hear the same accents, the same conversations, the same language across the borders. And that's how I can describe the border. There are so many disparities between Mexico and the US, and we cannot deny that. Even to cross the border, you can see how the US side of the border is prepared to receive, but the Mexican infrastructure is quite not there to cross the border. But then the people becomes the bridge between those communities that are so different, with so many gaps that we need to fill. And they have been filling those gaps with education, with culture, with sports, with music, with art, with economics, with falluqueras, with buses, with so many other things that are part of the phenomenon. So if you have never been in a border, just think in Mexico like TV, full color, and then think in the US like a little bit black and white, trying to make the transition. That's how the vibe feels. But if you're not paying attention to what you're seeing on the screen, probably you will feel the same on both sides of the border. And that's how the beauty of it, and that's something that the pandemic actually showed us. I spent so many lonely nights in Nogales, Arizona, working on a couple of stories for different media outlets. And if you have been in Nogales, obviously, you know Cody's, the owners of La Cinderella, that I remember that when I was a teenager, I used to cross the border and buy those like fancy shoes from there for my prom, from my quinceañera, from my best friend's quinceañera and everything. And he was telling us, it's like this 16 months has been like painting a wall and just staring at the wall and waiting for it to dry. This is how painful it's feeling this out without Mexicans. And that's actually showing us how intertwined are our relationships, our life, and that we cannot deny it. So if you've never been in Nogales, for example, that is the border that I know the best, just like them, probably you can get a better picture if you can like actually close your eyes, open your ears, and start feeling that people.
When I feel like, talking about the pandemic, people in Mexico with the visa, they weren't allowed to come here because of the pandemic. But then us, Americans, we were allowed to go there whenever we wanted to, whether you're vaccinated or not. And I think for me, that's one of the things I always brought up, because I have family there. And it affected them, the levels that, they had with coronavirus, and us, going there without any regulations too. I think that was another important story to tell from those two communities. And then something too, like we can't deny to a lot of us Americans like benefit from the medical tourism right across the border. I had a friend who told me one time he came from Texas and he went to party with his friends to Nogales, Sonora, and he's like, it was really funny. I noticed like most of the girls were wearing braces. It was like, yeah, because we get it for free, or, you know, I mean, like almost for free, comparing to how much you pay here in the US. So, you know, we all have gone into the dentist or something. I know I go to the dentist across the border. And so, you know, that's another story. You know, we also benefit from Mexico. I think both of us benefit from each other. And it's important to talk about that. You know, I think when, was it in October when the border reopened? And I remember pitching the story, you know, I sent probably like a 2-page email telling them about why the story was important to be, you know, for us to be there in Nogales, Arizona, to talk about the impact and the positive, you know, outcome of Mexicans coming across the border, because it's a positive story. They bring billions, you know, money that they spend here in sales tax, to benefit our streets, our parks, our schools, and I wasn't allowed to go there. But then when it comes to, you know, if it's undocumented immigration, they, you know, the numbers that we gave for encounters, like they send you right away. So how do you guys feel about, like, have you guys faced, because I know I faced those challenges where I have to fight different people in management to show them why those stories matter. Did you guys have also those challenges reporting on the border? And I'll start with you, Kendall.
Yeah, I don't know if Maritza had something she wanted to say before I start.
Let's go with you, Maritza. Ahora sí ya nos estamos agarrando sin pelos.
No, digo, para que esto no se vea así como que 1, 2, 3. No, I was thinking about that day when the border reopened. Kendall was there, I was there, Angela, probably you were there, but we met before, so I don't know. But it was more, so the border was closed for 18 months.
I wasn't there. I wasn't there.
Oh, you missed it. That was his story. Oh, well, let me paint you this picture. The border was closed for 18 months after almost 19 months. There was a huge expectation. I remember that it was like, if you think the numbers, I don't have the latest numbers right now, but it's like 7 billion people crossed the border, the US. And then we were expecting like a huge line of Mexicans dying to cross the border. No, it wasn't like that. It was an awkward silence. The first night, only the first 1 hour, there was traffic trying to cross the border. And probably they were waiting long lines because of us, the media, that they were staging in the middle of the port of entry, just interrupted traffic. But no. And it was fun because there was people that just wanted to cross the border to go to Walmart, and Walmart closed at midnight and they opened the border at midnight. So it was like, but there was this, I remember very kindly that it was a family that it was like 10 or 12 that got into the first light as soon as you cross the border through the consigned port of entry. That is La Garita de Abajo, as we know it in Mexico. As soon as you cross the border, the first light, they were waiting with this like pancarta saying, "Welcome, we miss you so much." But then I remember that I stayed late that day. Next day, I woke up really early. I went before 6 a.m. to Mariposa port of entry. That is the other port of entry that you have in Nogales, just to weigh how much people were trying to cross. No one. It was like one, and I was freezing, and then like a half an hour later, another one, and then it was truck, and that was it. Then I came back to the consignee because I had an interview with CBP and everything. Is like, nobody's crossing. So it took us a while just to revive and revamp that relationship that we have with Mexico. And remember, the disparities during the border were actually widening that gap because Mexico vaccinated so many people with vaccines that they weren't actually allowed in the United States. But in the first couple of weeks, nobody was asking for the vaccines. The U.S. Customs were like, "Pásele, mijito, pásele. We don't care." It's like, welcome, vaccinate. We have vaccines at Walgreens, so come on. So we need to talk about those moments that are actually really important in our relationship as well. It was a historic moment, and it wasn't as we expected as journalists. We were preparing for war that day. I remember I was carrying my cameras, my laptop, the hotspot, the power banks, and I was just sitting there alone at the McDonald's trying to write something. Even the internet was working. Kenda, what was your impression that day?
No, I mean, we had a similar experience. So my coworker Murphy Woodhouse was on the Sonora side, and I was on the U.S. side, on the Arizona side of the border. And yeah, we had been preparing and planning, and yeah, just that lead up to midnight when they were going to open the border and ease restrictions for people vaccinated. Again, like Maritza said, for those vaccinated with a vaccine that was allowed, which was not everybody, but we just expected it to be a huge wait. Like maybe you wouldn't want to try to cross that first day because maybe you would end up in a huge line. And yeah, there was a line right at first, and it seemed like it was going that way. And then, you know, talking to people the next day, it was so fascinating because it was, you know, some families who were reuniting, which was really beautiful. And then also people who are like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna pop over to Payless and see if I can get a pair of shoes, or I just wanted to check if, you know, my favorite store is even still open. So
and
you
they
know,
were closed, and they were so disappointed. It's like, what the?
Yes, exactly. I talked to a woman who's like, oh, you know, 2 years ago, the last time I was here, this was my favorite store, and now it's closed. I guess I'll have to find somewhere else. But I mean, I think that, like Marisa is saying, it shows how important these connections are, but also that things can change. I think things, you know, more movement is happening, but a lot of people's habits did change. People who went across the border every week, every day, for basics. Well, in 2 years of not being able to cross, almost 2 years, you have to find an alternative to that. And then the border reopens, and well, you know, you don't necessarily just go right back. And like you're both mentioning that, you know, that's really important for U.S. border communities, but also for Arizona as a whole. And you know, I think we're still waiting to see how much of a long-term impact that's going to have.
Yeah. I mean, I think my sister is a different, like she was just waiting to go and buy detergent. I'm like, they sell detergent in Mexico. Like you can buy detergent. And it's like, it's not the same, Lily. So,
and we wanted tortillas, and they wanted
yeah.
milk and cheese. That was the thing that my mom always said, like, tráeme leche, mijita, y jamón. No sé por qué.
So funny. So for you, Angela, what are some of the challenges that you have faced when reporting on the border?
That's a great question. I think, well, I do want to add on to what you were saying about the border reopening. I mean, I actually wasn't there for that day because I couldn't find housing here and start my job. And that's actually been a big challenge, is finding housing in Nogales, Arizona right now. And, you know, it's not a story that national media outlets are picking up, but this is happening here. This is the reality for a lot of people. And I experienced it myself. I'm in an apartment after 2 months of searching here. And, but, you know, that was a challenge. And I think, I know earlier we were talking about the differences between different border communities. Nogales, Santa Cruz County, it's a very rural county, and it lacks a lot of the resources I witnessed growing up in Philly. I mean, you know, you can't find an apartment anywhere. And so I know this isn't exactly geared toward your question, but like I experienced that challenge trying to report on the border, and now I'm able to talk to people about that challenge as well and figure out, okay, like why is this problem so prevalent and what can be done to create more affordable housing opportunities here. And it is a border story because it's happening here. And a few like people I've spoken to have said the pandemic is sort of behind it because some families living in Nogales, Sonora, they knew that closure was happening and they said, okay, why don't I move to the Arizona side? My kids go to school there, I might as well. And so, you know, it's this thing where if the population is growing, that's amazing. So how can we get more housing so people have places to live? So that's why it's so interesting to live here, because you experience the challenges that others are. Like you are part of the community. And I'm really lucky that I had a lot of people helping me find a place, but it exposes you to some of the problems here that you wouldn't have thought about if you were just, again, watching something about the border on Fox or CNN.
And that's such an important story, Angela, because, we are seeing the housing, crisis all over. And it's really interesting. I get a list for me to see. I know Rio Rico was having some issues, but I don't know Nogales is also having the same issues. So that's definitely a really important story to cover, and a challenge. It's a challenge, whatever challenge it is that you're facing. Reporting to do your work, it's a challenge. And so thank you for sharing that. That was really important. And we were talking about Fox. So I guess I'll go to my next. Sorry, my puppy is crying because he wants to go play. But what needs border communities have when it comes to the type of news that we're currently seeing on the border? And I mean, I can name a few. The first that come to my mind, it's Fox News. I follow a reporter that I actually went to school with, and he's been reporting on the border in Texas, and it's every encounter, 30 people just crossed the border, right? And so it's just the way that it's been reported. Like, I don't think it's fair. There are a lot of issues there, but what are some of the needs that you guys see in those communities? Because we just heard from Angela the housing problem, and that needs to have that attention. Yeah, we're not seeing it as much in other news outlets, but if it's something about border encounters or something else, they're right there at the border. So how come we don't get attention for these other types of stories that also impact that community? What do we need to do? And I'll go with you, Kendall.
Sure. No, I think this question is so important, and I think that this has been touched on a couple of times, and I feel really glad to be here on this panel with Angela and with Maritza, because I think for me, like, one of the big needs for border communities is robust local news. We need Nogales International, and we need Conecta Arizona, and we need to have strong local news that's reporting not just for the interests of an outside audience, but for the needs of people in the community who want to understand what's going on with their housing, who need to know how things like border restrictions are impacting their community, and a million other things, from local sports to restaurants and everything else. And I think we're at a time in the U.S. where we're seeing a lot of local news outlets struggling and even closing. I think every local community deserves robust local reporting. And certainly in the borderlands, where there's so much desire to extract these stories that are interesting to the outside, but just like anywhere else, they have stories that are interesting to the inside too. And so yeah, that's really important, and I'm really glad and proud to know so many wonderful people doing that reporting. As far as what we need for news that goes to the outside, and that's what I do more of now. I think, again, a lot of our news organizations are struggling, and I understand that, and I know that there are limitations, but I want to see reporters who live in the places where they are working and where they're reporting. I want to see people who know these places, and Liliana and Maritza, you both mentioned that, like, people who are from there, or people who at least are invested in these communities, and who can find the stories that are about housing, or that are about all of the life that happens just like anywhere else in the world. That's not just the border wall and immigration, which I think we've all said those are important stories. And there's also really important angles of those stories that are rarely told, or that aren't as much in the public eye. But I think when you have people who are not just stopping in for a few days, or coming and going, but are really invested in a place, that's when you get the most interesting reporting and the most important reporting, rather than frankly, sometimes things that are old news and stories that have already been covered locally, and and have maybe been covered dozens of times before. When you have somebody who's really familiar with the community, they know that.
Thank you, Kendall. And Angela, for you, what would you like to see more when it comes? I mean, you're there, you live there in Nogales. So what would you like to see more when it comes to the U.S. Mexico media coverage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like that Kendall kind of divided it, because it's like people here need news. They need to know what's going on. And then it's like the border can't just be covered for the outside community to keep explaining to them what it is. And I think both of those, it's really important to explain it to people in Philadelphia or across the world, but also people here. And I think, you know, a lot of times people, when they find out I'm from Philly, they're like, wow, this must have been a culture shock to you. And really, like, the bigger culture shock for me is that I went, not that I'm living in a border community, because it's like, okay, I grew up in a city and I heard different languages all the time and I loved it. I think it's awesome. And but the bigger culture shock for me was going from an urban community to a very small town, where you're not always getting the minutes from city council meetings. You're not always getting updated on what public officials are doing. And I think in a city like New York, if that happens, there's 8 million people. Someone's going to make a big deal out of it. Here, people are, you know, again, a lot of families, a lot of people working, and not everybody has time to go to like the Board of Supervisors meeting I was at today at 9:30 in the morning. So I think when you're in, and this just goes for, I think, rural America and small town America, like, it's, these local outlets are really important, because like someone has to do it. And I didn't realize that until I, you know, even when I moved to Flagstaff, you start to realize, like, I don't know, for some reason my brain didn't register that there were towns of 50,000 people or cities of 50,000 people. And so I think, and I've gotten comments from people, not here, but just, you know, people sort of like, oh, you're covering city council meetings. You know, one editor I'd worked for as a freelancer a while back, you know, kind of said that it was like a step down for me. And I think people forget sometimes that, like, first of all, like, sorry, my cat's playing in the background, but, you know, people forget that that reporting is so important. And I just think there also needs to be just engagement between the reporter and the community. You know, what do they want to know about? What are they upset about? What are they angry about? What are they excited about? So I think local journalism, even though newspapers are struggling right now, the importance has not gone away. I think if anything, it's amplified.
And I mean, the word de Nogales, I always like to tell this to my students, you know, because everyone wants to start in a bigger market. But I personally love Nogales International. Some of the best stories that I reported on were first reported by reporters on the ground in Nogales. I remember this story clearly. It was about holding police and Border Patrol accountable there in Nogales. So I don't know if you guys remember Marisol Garcia. She was allegedly shot in the head during she was being smuggled into the country. And so I read the story first in Nogales International, and the only image that I had really to use was from a reporter, photographer at Nogales International. And I read the story and I was like, something's going on here. And I started digging for it, and I found a lady, and that's how I found out that she got shot in the head. And my story was actually cited by this group of congressmen and women in DC, you know, asking for more background on this CIT units that are called. But all of that, like, it was a report, they cited me, but like, you know, my report really originated from the work that a reporter did on the ground in Nogales International. And if it wasn't because of that reporter being there, you know, who took that image, the only image that we had for the story, you know, the story wouldn't be where it is. Just because ABC 15 is a bigger outlet, you know, and it has a bigger voice, it really came from them. And I gave them credit throughout my story, but like, that's where you see how important it is to have those outlets locally, right? Because I remember when I called the police to ask them for a police report, they told me, oh, we don't have a police report. I'm like, what do you mean you don't have a police report, right? So like, if I was a reporter and I can see that, Angela, you know, maybe facing those issues where, because they're a small community, they're not used to having people like holding them accountable. And so it is important. Your presence there is important. So to your editor, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, your presence there is so important. We definitely need more reporters like you in those communities. So thank you so much. I appreciate you being there and doing important work in Nogales. And so I'll go with that with you, Maritza. So what would you like to see more? You know, you have extensive, you live there, you grew up there at the border. So what would you like to see more when it comes to the U.S. Mexico media coverage?
I would like to pitch in a little bit about what we need. We need resources for local journalism. And when you're working like in Spanish or for communities of colors, you always have like the tiniest slice of the cake that is being shared with everybody. So we need resources. We as local journalists, sometimes we need to stop looking for a place in a bigger table. It's like, let it be. Build your own table. And then I can promise you that you're gonna get invited to the other table that you wanted it to be in the first place. But then probably you don't wanna join them anymore. So that's something that actually happens. I'm living it right now with Connect Arizona. What do we need as well? We need to listen to the communities that we serve. We as journalists, we are so used to be providing information all the time that we don't take the time to stop and see what is going on, what my community needs, what do they want to know? Do you want to get more involved with educations? Probably I need to start attending to those school district board meetings. Probably if they don't know how to go to one of the city council meetings, let's organize, and they bring the documenters, a civic movement that it has been going on everywhere nationally, but in Arizona. Why are we not doing that? We need to start that. And we need to start reporting from a different perspective, because as journalists, we sometimes let our egos to go through our stories, and we shouldn't. That's something that we always need to fight, because it matters who tells the story, but also matters how we tell the stories that we do. What do I want to see? More coverage in the border. That's something that I'm working on right now with Connect Arizona. We're going to launch a mini podcast for WhatsApp about the human bridges that we build instead of the walls that we keep building through politicians, to giving echo to the same story all over and over again, to being the fixers of those journalists that just come to the border just to pursue one story, and they never credit us, even though we are using our local resources, our local connections, our contacts, and our expertise. This is what we need to start changing the narrative. And we need to empower more local journalists, give them the training to do so. Because we're expecting these new generations of journalists just to show up in the border and start producing like crazy, like if we were like, I don't know, como si fuéramos una maquila. And we are not. We are telling stories, and stories are always related to people. So how do we want to change the narrative if we are not investing in the people who's telling the narrative? And we need to give more echo, not voice, because everybody has a voice. So we are not the voice of the immigrants. We are not the voice of the border. They have their own voices. They have their own accents. What we need to do is start giving echo to the community story through their same voice, through the way of living the life in the border, through their needs, their challenges, and actually their success, and changing the way that we measure the success of our stories. So we need to start changing local journalists not to measure the success of the number of clicks, page stats, and start measuring through the testimonials to the effect and the impact that we're having in the same communities that we're trying to build on.
Yeah, I mean, I love that part of also investing in journalists, you know. I remember I had a HBO going to Nogales to follow up on a story I was doing, and they called me, a producer called me like, hey, do you think you can be here in an hour? We were trying to do a walk and talk with you. I was like, in an hour? I'm in Phoenix. Do you even know the distance between Nogales and Phoenix? And obviously for free, right? So I think it's important for that too, you know, to help, you know, invest in our journalism outlets, so that they can also invest in our journalists to get paid more, so they have that incentive to, you know, to be more motivated to report, because it's not easy, and it's not fair, you know, that they don't get paid enough. And we know that, you know, we've been doing this for a while, so we know that, you know, you don't get, you know, you're not going to become rich, but you know, we do it because it's a service to our community, and we deeply care about them too. And so with this, I think I'll go to questions from a panel. It's 6:40 already. So let me see. I don't know, Javier, do you want to take it from here for our questions? Okay.
I think can you see there's some in the chat, and Angela was also looking at those.
Yes. All right. So I'll go from here.
Yeah,
I don't know where I
please.
put my glasses. I need glasses now. Let me see. So, all right. So one question: you grew up at or with the border. How has living there changed in a generation from the last 20 years? So Maritza, how has it changed in the last 20 years?
Completely. Well, when I was a little kid, you were born, they take you to the, well, in Mexico to get your birth certificate, because it's not done like this in the hospital or anything. And then you went to La Forma 13, that it was that kind of like thing that you needed to get your visa. And you use your same visa with your baby photo forever. So it was really nice. It was really nice. But crossing the border was part of, I don't know, the whole celebration. We used to cross back and forward so easily. The border wall has always been there. So that is nothing new. That's nothing to do with the past administration. That's nothing to do with this one. The border wall was there already. What has changed is we are putting more barriers for legal and unauthorized immigration to the US. We are not paying attention to dual citizenship. So there are US citizens and Mexican citizens, and there are Mexican citizens that are also US citizens. So we need to take an acquaintance that. But I think something that our kids, for example, that is like third generation or second generation, are going to notice is like before, we used to talk about the border as a place of commitment, as a place of reunion, as a place that brought us together. Now, if you talk to the newest generations, even the ones that are documented over here on this side of the border, they have this political component all the time in their conversations. They have fear. My kids, because I have been working so much with migrant kids and following up with them since 2014, they know the stories about these kids being separated at the border. They can hear them cry, telling me the stories that they spent 90 days in New York and their parents were in Florence or Texas. Their perception of the border is completely different as the one that we had when we were kids coming to celebrate the birthday in the US and buying milk and ham and coming back and forward. And that's also our fault as journalists, because we have been, I don't know, prolongando, sorry for my Spanglish, but we have been prolongando the image that the other media outlets that had more resources have been putting into our minds. And because we think that if we do this hard news journalists, we're going to be better journalists, and we're not. So we're going to change the narrative as soon as we realize that we're part of the community that we are serving, and part of that community is our kids.
That was where you actually answered two questions that I had in here. The next one is, do you work together with European news outlets, and do they reflect your view of the things in life at the border? Who wants to answer this? I don't work with European outlets, so.
I do. I don't want to take over the conversation, but there was this fantastic documentary. There was actually a 7-hour documentary that we worked with Random Media. Then it was but BBC and then Discovery Channel, and they did it English and Spanish and Korean and well, so many languages. And it was about the 7 walls that the man has built, the human has built to separate countries like Germany, like Korea, Palestine. And I was in charge of producing the Mexico-US part of it. And the crew was from Gales, and it was from the UK, was one Irish. And I remember when I got them to Nogales, it's like, oh my God, you actually have this. And it's like, yeah, what do you think? This is the border. And it's like, but do you need a passport? Yes, you need a passport. It's like, but we want to go and have tacos in Mexico. We've never been in Mexico. And it's like, but you need your passport. And do you have a work visa? Because we have the equipment and we need to register the equipment and get the license and the insurance and everything because you have a lot of money invested in this equipment and we're going to Mexico. And they were so amazed that we were so close and they couldn't cross the border because they hadn't, well, the passport was in the hotel in Tucson. It was like, how come? This is like, and this is so hard. Why people cross the border? Another, for example, another memory that I have is like one of the producers was wearing yoga pants all the time. And he's like, we're going to the desert. Probably you want to like get jeans before we leave. No, I'm just fine. And then she was just next to us a water and she couldn't handle it the whole, because she got like, se espinó toda. And he's like, I told you to wear jeans because the yoga pants are not the best. But they didn't believe that, because something that they have always seen is just people just against the wall or trying to chase or just jumping the fence. And that rarely happens. But I really like rediscovering the border through their eyes, because we take so many things for granted when we are reporting the stories. For example, just to give context about what's happening in the border. So yes, we do work with European outlets, George, and you are VIP with me. So shoot me an email.
Hey, and I mean, this is not a European outlet, but I remember from what you were right now talking, you know, how the person that was wearing yoga pants, I don't know if you guys remember the story with CNN. It was this high profile journalist who came and did a story about the new military tactics the border crossers are using, you know, the booties with the carpet. Oh my God. And I remember I was like, hold on. I grew up in Caborca. I remember going to Altar when I was probably like 10 years old, and people were in those booty carpets at the plaza. So what are you talking about? So I think, you know, a lot of times we get people that don't know nothing about the border, and they're reporting on these things, you know, and because it was in CNN and maybe air in like, you know, Washington or whatever, where they're so far away from us, they probably thought, oh my God, that's on you. And, you know, so yeah, so who remembers this? I mean, let's talk about that when you guys have seen things, maybe, you know, from other outlets that don't really portray the reality of the border.
I mean, I think that's such a great example, and I think that, you know, having reported the Nogales International as a local paper, sometimes it doesn't reflect the reality, or I think that that's what you just, the example you gave is really indicative of what I often see, which is, you know, maybe it is part of what's happening, or it's not like made up necessarily, although that also does happen. But it's something that when it's not new, it's not news for those of us who've been covering it for a while. And I think that's the problem when you're not familiar with the place. Everything you see, everything you learn, it's like mind-blowing, because there is a lot of really interesting things and really intense things that happen at the border. And I think that's great for reporters to find out. But, you know, I think it is the responsibility of journalists who are coming into these communities to realize that just because it's new to you doesn't mean that it's new, and that nobody has reported about the carpet booties, or, you know, oh my gosh, you know, nobody has thought about what the border looks like, or the history here, or there's a lot of those things that it can be almost comical if, like you were saying, you didn't know that somewhere somebody was hearing that and thinking, oh, this is new, it's going to shape their perspective of what's happening and maybe what's going on at the border, because it's just like, okay, this is something that I already knew, and there are people who've known this for way longer than I have, and then to see it reported as though it's novel is it can be kind of disappointing, but I also think, to your point, it can be dangerous for the way that it shapes people's perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have that responsibility. Same thing when, we talk about words, the way we report stories. I remember it was last year around the summer when we were having an increase on asylum seekers, and I saw surge and flood being used everywhere. And I remember emailing my news director, who is an amazing person who always wanted to listen to my perspective. And I told him, I was like, we can't be dehumanizing people by using words like flood and surge. And he connected to AP, and he found that it was actually the AP was releasing a memo to change that wording. And then he sent an email to the whole newsroom about not using those words. So yeah, it's important also we have a responsibility, a huge responsibility with what we say and what we report on. And another question that I have, and I go to you, Angela, for this one. So this question says, can you talk about your experience, or about my dog, can you talk about your experience with language as a border journalist? To what extent has speaking local varieties of language or connecting over a shared language helped you in forming community, understanding local stories, and the experiences of borderlands residents?
Sorry, is that in the Q&As? Okay.
Yes, it's in the Q&A, the last one.
It's the last.
Here, you see it? I think it was a direct message to me. Okay, so can you talk about your experience with language as a border journalist? To what extent has speaking local varieties of language or connecting over a shared language helped you in forming community, understanding local stories, and the experiences of borderland residents?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to make sure I got that right. Yeah, actually, so I started, like, my first experience coming to Nogales was about 5 years ago, as an intern in college. And thanks to that experience, I was able to I made like some amazing friends in this area who are still my friends and very dear to my heart. And hanging out with them was like, I never heard Spanish used that way before. Just like the Spanglish, and also the Sonoran like slang, just all of that, just the regionalisms, I guess is like the English word for it. That's been, first of all, it's just really cool because it's just a beautiful thing to hear. It's really like, it's like a verbal depiction of what the border is. It's like this mismatch of cultures and languages. And yeah, being able to use that has been really helpful. I'm actually like afraid that if, say, I went to like Mexico City tomorrow, I'm afraid that I would be using so many like if I wanted to park my car and I say like embarcar, which is like not the way to say park, but it's used here. I'm like afraid that I'll get some weird looks in other parts of the world. But yeah, I think it's another like beautiful part about this region. And it has like, again, like Nogales isn't always viewed as a cultural center, like a place of culture, rich culture. And I think the language really shows that. And being able to use not only the Spanish, but also the slang, it helps connect you to people, especially young people. And I think it's really important. I think it would be very, very different if, coming down here and only speaking English would be really a very different experience for sure.
We'll teach you rather quickly to learn Spanish as you don't. You live in Nogales, it's amazing. And yeah, I mean, the slang as, I mean, have you heard que pirata? So basically it doesn't mean like literally, it doesn't mean what a pirate, it means something else. So, and I'll go to the next question, what it is. So how hard is it for you to cross into Mexico to conduct reporting? And are there reasons for you to be afraid in light of the frequent killings of Mexican journalists? So I would say this one for me, working here, I probably only crossed twice, and I was told you're going at your own risk. Working for an English news outlet, I was never allowed to go across the border. Working as an independent journalist, I wanted to do a documentary near my hometown in Caborca. And my mom basically banned me from doing that. She made me promise her that I would not go there and do stories because not only do I put myself at risk, but I put my whole family that lives there at risk. But I know a couple of you guys do go very often. I mean, Kendall, you live there in Hermosillo. I'm so jealous because that's what I wanted to go to college when I was in high school, and eat coyotas every day. So what are some of the, how hard has it been for you, being there with what we're seeing with journalists being killed in Mexico?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate enough to actually live and work from Hermosillo, and I'll just say that it's not hard for me to cross back and forth, and I have the privilege of having U.S. citizenship, which meant even during border restrictions, I was able to keep crossing, unlike a lot of people. And I think, I mean, there are definitely reasons for journalists in Mexico to be afraid in light of the killings. This year has been devastating to see just the amount of danger that journalists face in Mexico. And it's not new. The numbers in just the first 3 months of this year have been really shocking and horrifying. I think I personally have not faced a lot of danger. And, again, I think part of that is being from the US and having the backing of a US news organization. And, but frankly, it's also because of what, we do and don't cover. And we're not investigating into organized crime and things like that. And I really respect all of my Mexican colleagues who face a lot more risk than I personally do. And I think all of us, in the US and those of us who are from the US owe them a lot of support because they're doing incredibly important work with a lot of risk from all sides. If you investigate corruption or if you investigate organized crime, and those things touch a lot of elements in life, then it's a scary world for a lot of people.
It is, yeah. And for you, Maritza, you probably know more people that work and live there too as well.
Yeah, when you work in the US, you still face some challenges and dangers, obviously. But I think it's more digital hacking, different, like cybersecurity. When you work in Mexico, it's actually your physical security, the one that is in danger. I have so many friends. Well, when I work in an imparcial, because I worked in an imparcial a long time ago, when I first started my career, one of my colleagues disappeared, Alfredo Jimenez Mota. He was covering power, he was covering corruption, and we always told him, it's like, this newspaper doesn't have your back. So be mindful of that. And he disappeared, and we never found him. And probably he's not alive. Even though we want to have our hopes up, this is Mexico. But the thing is, like, I cross the border really often, and I go back and forward by myself at night. I haven't had any experience, any kind of dangers. I even was working on a documentary. I don't know if you all remember the massacre that happened in northern Mexico, where 3 moms and 5 kids died. they were ambushed, and it was a terrible, terrible, terrible situation. And I've been working on a documentary for that. It's gonna be out pretty soon. Insert commercial here. No, but I never felt unsafe, but I have felt unsafe in Ajo, Arizona, when they call me Mexican several times, when I'm in a Trump protest and my English is not perfect and I have a very thick accent, and they have come back out to me, or because I was just wearing a face mask in the past elections. There's people armed in those protests. So sometimes it is harder for us as Latinas, as immigrants, as non-English native speakers to work in the US than facing in Mexico. But my Mexican colleagues, they do deserve the credit, because they're making what, $500 per month, and they're putting their life at risk, and they don't have the resources that we do have in the United States. We do journalists from a very privileged point of view in the US. I remember Telemundo, for example, because I used to work for Telemundo. If we were going to a protest, we had this security guard. We were never allowed in Mexico without a security guard. And depending the part of Mexico that you were planning on going, is that the quality of the security guard. So I remember something happened in Caborca, and Ruben Pereira, who was like a reporter with us, is like, he was waiting for Chuck Norris to come and being able to go to Caborca, because that's how we dealt with it. But yeah, the disparity is really very different. And Mexico can be really violent, but we as journalists as well, we need to be prepared to work in a war zone. And there are so many organizations like International Women in Media Foundation that they provide this HIFA training for free for journalists. I've been training on that, just in case if you get kidnapped, what are you gonna do? If you get in a shooting, that I have been in shootings, what do you need to do? How do you protect your cyber security? Because I've been hacked several times, and it's like, we need to protect ourselves, because we need to also protect the sources that are trusting their life to us.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about how, you know, we have this privilege. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about when I was reporting on the elections here in the US, I had a bodyguard with me all day. Like, I couldn't even go to the restroom without him being like literally by my side. So we definitely have a lot of privilege here, and you know, the work that they do in Mexico, it's really de admirarse, como se dice en español. And so I have another question. Let me see. So this webinar is about women journalists covering the US border. Does your gender impact your reporting, your perspective? And I'll start with this one. I think for me, the last time I was at the border, we interview migrants, asylum seeking family, and I remember I was in with the dad and his son, and he let me talk to his son, and as I was talking to him, interviewing him, you know, I started like, you know, it's just hard for you not to feel their pain. And I remember the Border Patrol agent who was with me told me, "Oh my God, Lily, I thought you were gonna cry." And I was like, well, it's just, we are humans, you know, and I'm a mom, I have a daughter. And so I do feel, you know, we still feel pain, and we still, you know, it's okay for us to like break down, like, if, you know, we are still human beings. And I think because of that, I don't know if that has a lot to do with how I report on asylum seekers, but I never show their faces. And I learned that like probably like, I don't know, 6 years ago when I started doing it. Even if I ask for permission, I don't, because I always feel that I'm not being fair enough, because, you know, they may say, yes, it's okay for you to show my face, but am I really explaining to them that, you know, once it's online, it's going to be online forever? So I don't do that. And I remember when I was with my photographer, he told me, Lily, that's a really hard call. How are we going to tell this story? It's a really impactful story. You know, you want to hear the pain that they are facing, and then, you know, they're crying. And I was like, well, then we're not really good journalists if we can't do this without showing their faces. And we did it without it. And I think, he told me he learned a lot that day with me. But have you guys, has that impacted you guys at all when you guys are covering stories, especially when it comes to vulnerable families at the border? And I'll start with you, Angela.
Yeah, I really think that's an excellent point. I think we're taught in J school, get the first and last name as if that's like it, as if there's this very fine line. But I think, yeah, especially with asylum seekers, that's something you really have to think about being a journalist, but also being a human being. And I think that's such an excellent point, that you're talking to people who have been through so much trauma, might have grown up without a lot of internet access. I mean, everyone has all asylum seekers have different stories, but yeah, they might not realize, oh, Telemundo, I know, they might not be like ABC 15. I mean, I think it's important to get the emotion and the story and the heart of that story across, but also keep sensitivity in mind. And I mean, just like growing up, I was always told I'm a sensitive person, I'm an emotional person. And I used to think that was like a hindrance to my reporting, but I think as of late, it's really helped me with my reporting, because I care what, I love to talk to people and I love to listen to their stories. And I think people do appreciate that. And I think listening is a skill it's a very underrated skill, especially today when we're all, it's all about like your brand and what you're saying on social media. But like being able to listen is so important, and being able to empathize with people and have that come across. And I mean, just a couple weeks ago was the second anniversary of Title 42. And so that was something I was grappling with a lot when speaking to asylum seekers. And you do your best to balance everything. And I try to give everybody my contact information that I can, just to be as available and reciprocal as possible, and just really try to listen. But it's a lot. Yeah.
It is. And so for you, Kendall, how has does your gender impact your reporting or your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely does. I think all of our identities and our experiences impact us as reporters. And I think it's really important. I think even when I was in school not that long ago for journalism, there's this idea that we have to be objective, and I understand where that concept is coming from. But every person, whether you're a woman or a man, whether you're a person of color or not, we all have perspectives. And certainly being a woman, I have a perspective, and it certainly is going to impact the things that feel worth covering for me, the things that strike me from a story, the angles that I'm going to find the most compelling, without a doubt. And I think sometimes, like Angela is saying, sometimes being a sensitive person or who's emotional, or being a woman in general has seemed like a hindrance, or maybe we've been made to think that it could be. But I felt like it can also be a benefit. It can also open spaces to you. And here in Hermosillo, I've covered a lot of women's movements, and women's movements that are separate. Like they don't want men in marches, and they don't want men as the reporters covering it. And so, it has opened those spaces to me because I'm a woman. And that's not to say that no man could do those stories, but I think that being a woman and having that experience does inform you in a positive sense to be able to cover those kinds of stories.
That was such a great example of the access that you get sometimes for stories, the trust that we get sometimes for some people to tell, their stories, because they identify with us, because we are women. like them. And so same question for you, Maritza, and this will be the last question before we wrap up. So does your gender impact your reporting, your perspective?
Yes. It is not just my gender, it's whatever I have been carrying as a Latina immigrant journalist working in the US. I think we need to start talking about maternity, for example. Being a woman and being a mom changed so much how I cover immigration, for example. And how some of the stories that I was telling before I had kids, I didn't have the sensitivity that I have now being a mom. But also in the workplace, the pay gap between genders is a real thing. So, and then they're expecting us to raise kids as we weren't working full time, and they expect us to work more than full time as we didn't have any kids. So we have a double standard in not just in the US, Latin America is the same stuff. So we need to be very mindful, and gender actually plays a huge part. Who's getting a raise in your newsroom, who's getting more opportunities, who's getting right now that we're working remotely, who does more at home, for example. Is like we need to carry in our shoulders not just all the gaps that we have at work, but that we have as a society as well. We are extremely resilient as women, but for that we're struggling as well with mental health, and we need to start talking about those things and the lack of resources that are available for us as journalists of color, as journalists working a different language, as journalists being women in the US, in Mexico, and whatever. I'm looking at my notes, and I do take notes. Something that I have and I shared with Liliana and Kendall that they were saying, when I covered those migrant kids that were separated at the border, I was crying when I was making those interviews. And I respected the silence, and I paced myself, and it's like, don't try to fill silences as we do as moms, as we do as women. It's like, wait, stop, listen. And it is okay to cry, because I think the most important thing that we have as journalists, as well as credibility and our byline, is empathy, that we can connect to the communities that we're serving. So it is okay for us to get angry. It is okay for us to cry during an interview. Another one that I just did was about grief during the pandemic with border restrictions, families that didn't have the opportunity to say goodbye. Or a colleague of mine that spent a year with her husband in the hospital, and that she finally had to decide to disconnect him. And it was so painful. And I spent 3 hours of my life crying with her. And she wasn't crying, and I was the one who was crying. But it was those stories that get you so deep. Or when the Guarderia ABC fire happened in Mexico. How can you pace yourself and not crying and not feeling? And it's not hormonal, as everybody says, because we're women. No, it is not. It is something that we have. We're humans. And it is okay to embrace it. And it is okay to embrace that we're women and we don't want to be men. And that's okay. And it's okay to understand those movements, feministas that we're seeing. And it's okay not to have an opinion about the abortion if you don't feel like, and if you're pro or con, whatever, it is okay for you to start feeling those mixed feelings. But it's better just to make peace with that you're women and you don't need to be perfect, and it's okay for you to stop fighting as a white man for the same privilege that your colleagues in the newsroom have. And that's it.
That was. I'm so glad you're doing the story. You know, as you were talking, I was just thinking, it brought me flashbacks from during the pandemic. I think it was like probably, I want to say July. We lost our uncle. He died in Nogales, Sonora, and the whole family, we were in Zoom watching, the funeral and how he was being buried. And I don't think we never like really stopped and think like, well, that's not normal. This is not normal. And we just, I think it's a taboo too in our culture when it comes to mental health. But I don't think none of us like check out on each other and see, how are you doing? Are you okay? We just went on with our life and then just see it as like the new normal, and there's nothing normal about it. So I'm so glad you're doing that story. It's so important. I know my family lived through it when we lost our uncle. So guys, thank you so much. I mean, like I said, we can go on, and I can just go right now and get my coffee, and we'll just stay here until midnight talking. There are so many stories. There's so much when it's about women journalists reporting on the border. We can do another panel, reporting on the pandemic, reporting on healthcare, reporting on police, reporting on everything. We do it all. We do it all. But thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that was here with us today, and really appreciate you all, and thank you for being part of this important conversation. And now I'll leave it to you, Javier.
Muchísimas gracias a las cuatro por su participación, por sus perspectivas y por este momento educativo para nuestro público. Really thankful for your participation to the four of you, and for really bringing all these issues that sometimes get overlooked and underappreciated in terms of how the audiences and the public think of journalism, and especially women journalists. In terms of the challenges and the daily fight that they have to, as Maritza was articulating, establish not only with the subject matter and the research and the actual writing, but also the daily conditions in which journalists are not only in danger, such as in the case of countries such as Mexico, but also the labor conditions of journalism in the United States that are being mentioned in this conversation, and are part of a larger conversation in terms of what does journalism mean for a democracy, and also for continuing to make institutions of government accountable to our citizens. And so I think this is an important conversation. We really appreciate all your angles. You bring another perspective to how we're looking at the border, from the personal to the professional, and also to the cultural, in terms of the nuances you have provided in your own experiences. And I'm really, again, thankful to the Conference Center team for helping to put this together. And we hope to do this next year. I think it should become part of what we do in terms of these conversations. I think we need to have a better relationship with the media, and we really need to value the work of people that are keeping us informed in more ways than one. And the other thing is that I want to encourage the audience to follow our colleagues here in social media, and also make sure that you read and you follow the reporting. I think you're making a difference, in my opinion. And that's one of the reasons that we thought of having this panel. So we hope in the future to continue these conversations in plural, and also to bring to this Fronterizas project that we have at the Conference Center, this diversity and plurality of voices that we need to make sure that mainstream audiences are more familiar with. And also, as it was mentioned and suggested, make the border communities the place of enunciation of their own stories and their own struggles, and have that discourse formalized and normalized in more ways than one. So we really think that's part of the goal that the Fronterizas Prize wants to do. And we're really, again, proud to have you here today. Again, a reminder, next Wednesday, we're going to have Dr. Rosana Reguillo talk about the effects of violence, and also of the many moments in which Mexican society, or the many challenges that Mexican society has been changing. And also on April 18, Maria Hinojosa, La Mera Mera, to come to Tucson and have a visit and join us here and share her experiences of crossing borders and building futures in her career. So we're really excited about this. The next show and tell is el 10 de mayo. May 10 is a significant day for some of you. And we're going to have it at the annex on the west side of the Mercado San Agustin. It's going to be in person. It's going to be about the arts in Tucson. And so we share more information with audiences as we go. So finally, my thanks, muchas gracias, and my encouragement for your work, and congratulations on your wonderful work. And again, thank you for joining us here at the Confluence Center. Nos despedimos, buenas noches, have a pleasant evening, and again, our thanks.